Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the session. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Paul Armstrong, and I'm a lawyer in the technology and data team here at Walker Morris. I've been working at the intersection of financial services, law, and technology for over 20 years now, which is a little bit of a depressing thought. Over the past few years, I've been watching the development of AI quite closely, and that's certainly not depressing. It's quite interesting to watch that technology evolve and grow. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about AI in financial services. So the integration of AI and machine learning certainly has the potential to reshape the landscape of the UK financial services sector quite dramatically. The AI developments that we're already seeing in the industry span quite a wide range of use cases, from customer interactions to optimizing risk management and helping to ensure regulatory compliance behind the scene. AI technology offers substantial opportunities really for increased efficiency, fostering innovation and enhancing customer service. So as we probably all know already, if deployed correctly, AI can help automate workflows, it can help streamline tasks, it can improve risk management, it can detect fraud, it can enhance customer experiences in a lot of different ways. So it has the potential to be a real net positive for the industry. Now, the Bank of England, the FCA, have done a number of surveys about AI over the past few years. The most recent one was in 2024. And if you looked at that survey, the sense you would get is that that the AI revolution's already happened and is already here, because 75% of firms, when surveyed, said they were already using AI. An additional 10% of firms said they were aiming to implement AI in the next 3 years. I think, in my personal opinion, whilst I don't disagree with that survey evidence, I think we need to look at it with a slight note of caution. I think it's a little bit too early to say whether we're imminently going to see AI fundamentally transforming the financial services industry. Many of the use cases that we've seen deployed so far have been limited to relatively low risk, internally facing areas, tending to focus on predictive AI, not generative AI. Now, as some of you will be aware already, predictive AI has been used in the financial services industry for quite some time, so arguably it's nothing new. And the use cases we're seeing up to now have got humans very much still in the loop, which is no bad thing, but is not really the sort of autonomous revolution that we're perhaps expecting. That said, even if the AI development is not quite at the rate that some people think it has been up to now, it is fair to say that the point at which we stand now does necessitate regulatory oversight, because there have undoubtedly been some big changes, and that regulatory oversight has to be focused on maintaining stability and protecting consumer interests in financial services. So AI can have a lot of benefits. It also does pose some challenges. The challenges are a relatively well-trodden path, but I do think it's helpful to talk about them now, just quickly, just to recap and set the scene. So one of the most significant challenges with AI systems is the risk of bias. So as we all know, AI models learn from the data that they're trained on. And if they're trained on data that reflects societal biases or any other form of bias, the AI system is probably going to perpetuate that bias and even in some cases amplify it, which would be even worse. Now, obviously, bias has the potential to lead to a number of bad outcomes, some of which could be unfair, some of which could be discriminatory from a customer's point of view. And the thing with bias is addressing it is not a kind of one and done situation. You've got to be careful when you're training your AI model to begin with that you're not training it on biased data. But then once you've discharged the system into the wild, you have to be continuing to monitor it and maintain it in an effort to detect whether it is spewing out any biased outputs, and if it is, to very quickly remediate and mitigate those. The next challenge posed by AI is explainability. So many AI systems effectively function as black boxes. To be honest, even if you speak to the developers themselves who've developed the AI system, they often cannot explain to the nth degree why and how the AI system is doing what it's doing. The lack of explainability can erode user trust in the system, can erode customer trust in the system. I think that's particularly corrosive in financial services because the financial services industry is very much built on trust, and the explainability of services and products has become increasingly important over the years. So explainability or lack thereof of AI systems is a particularly pertinent issue in financial services, I think. And also in financial services, the lack of explainability poses very real regulatory challenges, because a lot of what the regulator is seeking to do, particularly the FCA, who's with their customer-centric view, is wanting to make sure that products and services are readily explainable to the average customer and they're not getting confused as to what they're being sold or how their relationship with the institution is being managed. Next up, in terms of challenges, we've got accountability. So AI systems, as we all know, do get things wrong. They're definitely getting better, but whether they'll ever be 100% perfect remains to be seen. When the AI system gets it wrong, makes an error, or even worse, causes some harm to a user, who's accountable for that? It's not always easy to work out because the AI system, by definition, is going to be autonomous to a greater or lesser extent. So who, in terms of the humans involved, has ultimate accountability for what the AI system is doing? As I'll explain in a little bit, the senior managers and certification regime is vitally important from this perspective in the financial services space, but accountability is nevertheless a complex issue. Data privacy and security. So as we know, AI is trained on data, often vast quantities of data. Once it's been trained and is deployed in the wild, it will often continue to process and analyze data at sometimes a shockingly high volume and pace. So data privacy is very important, and data security is very important too. And as I'll talk about in a minute, how do you address that? Well, it's all about data governance and security measures, but AI does change the threat landscape and does necessitate a little bit of a review of those sorts of things. The evolving nature of the technology is what makes it quite exciting to use and to watch its development. But evolving nature creates challenges too, particularly from the point of view of the regulator. How do you appropriately and proportionately regulate a technology that is changing almost daily? Now, the government here in the UK and the regulators, as I'll explain in a minute, think the best way to do that is to try and be principles-based rather than rules-based in terms of your regulation of AI, and to try and be technology agnostic. And by that I mean try not to get too preoccupied with which particular flavor of AI you're looking at, whether it's agentic, predictive, etc., and instead focus on its outcomes. So I'll talk about the UK government's approach in a little bit more detail later on. But first, again, just to set the scene, And I've alluded to some of these already, but like what applications are we already seeing for AI in UK financial services? You might be seeing some or all of these use cases deployed to a certain extent already in your firm, but these are the main ones that we're seeing. So risk management, there's a lot of use cases for AI and risk management, ranging from enhancing credit scoring capabilities, enhancing underwriting processes, as I mentioned earlier, helping a firm to monitor its own compliance with various rules and regulations. How can AI do this, or why is it so good at doing this type of risk management activity? Well, it's its ability to analyze vast data sets quickly and to apply rules to the way in which that analysis is being done, with a view to try and identify certain trends or characteristics. So AI in risk management has the potential, and to a certain extent is already being very helpful, but clearly the AI needs to be functioning in an accurate and fair way. Bias, as I've mentioned, is an overarching challenge, but it's particularly pertinent when it comes to risk management, because you don't want to be unwittingly embedding any discriminatory practices in, say, your approach to credit scoring, product suitability, that type of thing. Explainability is also very key in the risk management space, because if you're using AI to risk manage, well, your risk management framework and the mechanisms within it are quite rightly going to be something that the regulator is going to be interested in. So you're going to have to be able to explain how the AI risk management tool is doing what it's doing to the satisfaction of the regulator. And that's easy to say, but not always easy to do. Fraud detection and prevention is another use case. So as I've mentioned, and as we know, AI can analyze vast data sets. It's very good at identifying intricate patterns and anomalies within those data sets. So that can be very, very helpful from the point of view of fraud detection and prevention. Again, perhaps stating the obvious, but fairness and accuracy is also incredibly important here too, right? Because if the AI system gets it wrong, well, one of two things could happen. It could be missing fraudulent activities, or perhaps more likely, it might start flagging false positives and identifying fraudulent activities, where in reality there's a perfectly explanation for the transaction or the customer behavior. If the AI starts to do that, that's going to have harmful effects, really, for perfectly innocent customers who aren't engaging in any fraud whatsoever. The other thing to bear in mind in the fraud space is that transaction data is analyzed for the purpose of fraud detection and prevention. Transaction data often can contain sensitive data. So adherence to data privacy regulations and data security is particularly pertinent. Algorithmic trading. So not all firms represented in this session will be engaged in trading activity. Those who are, there might be an even smaller subset who are doing algorithmic trading, but like, I'll mention it anyway, even if this use case isn't directly relevant for a lot of you. Algorithmic trading is being actively impacted by AI. That's because the techniques that are used for that types of trading are being refined and sort of turbocharged, if you like, by AI models and AI strategies. That has the potential to be very lucrative for the trading firms who are able to do that successfully. It does pose risks from, well, not just for the individual firms if the AI gets it wrong, but also systemically, because if a number of firms start using AI-powered trading strategies and the AI is getting it wrong in the same way in each case, that type of correlated behavior is going to have quite negative consequences for the system as a whole. So what you need is robust controls and vigilant oversight. That's quite easy to say, but often these algorithms are incredibly sophisticated. So once they're deployed, overseeing them and sense checking them is not always an easy thing to do, particularly when they are, as they often are, making trading decisions at high pace. Next up is customer service. I mean, this is a use case that is a lot easier conceptually for us to understand. AI evangelists talk about how customer service in all industries, but in financial services too, is going to be absolutely revolutionized by AI-powered chatbots and virtual assistants. This is where you kind of get the agentic AI coming in. I'm a little bit skeptical about that because regardless of the technical capabilities and the reliabilities of AI-powered chatbots, customers have got to get comfortable with using them, and they've got to get comfortable with using them for a range of support-related matters that at the moment they much prefer to speak to a human and interact with a human about. But that said, assuming we do see that kind of cultural change in society as a whole, yeah, these AI-powered chatbots and virtual assistants could make a very big difference, and already they are in certain sort of discrete areas. From a regulatory standpoint, though, it's vital from the regulator's perspective that any customer chatbot is enhancing the customer experience and not detracting from it in any way. How could a chatbot detract from the customer experience? Well, the obvious thing is it could start churning out incorrect advice, which would clearly be suboptimal in terms of customer service, but from a regulatory perspective would also be problematic. The other thing that more broadly a move towards AI chatbots and virtual assistants could herald would be a decline in sort of accessibility standards. And what I mean by that is, interacting with an AI chatbot often assumes that you know how to prompt it, you know what its limitations are, you know what types of phraseology it responds to more readily, and which types of things it struggles with. Over time, everybody might get used to that, but I think it's fair to say at the minute that requires a certain degree of sophistication on the part of the user, which not everybody understandably has. Finally, financial advice. So accessing personalized financial advice, getting investment recommendations that are tailored to your particular needs, your particular circumstances and aspirations. I think it's fair to say that that's something that is not readily available to most people, because it's quite an in-depth and sort of complex and nuanced service type of advice to provide. Again, AI evangelists say, well, AI systems, AI-powered robo-advisors are going to democratize all of that and make that type of sort of personalized, tailored financial advice available to everybody at nil or close to nil cost. Hopefully that will be the case, and we're certainly seeing moves in that direction. The regulator is always going to be interested in what these robo-advisors are doing, because the advice has got to be accurate. And in a way, it's almost harder to come up with quote unquote accurate advice in this sphere than it is on, say, just a general customer service inquiry. Because in order to give accurate and appropriate advice, you've got to have not just access to certain financial data, but you've got to have, I think, quite a nuanced understanding as to the individual that you're advising and what their aspirations are, particularly if they've got some degree of vulnerability. And it's not easy for a machine to do that in the same way as a human would. So when it comes to these customer service, financial advisory type use cases, the consumer duty, as I'll explain in a minute, is vitally important. So what's happening in the UK? You'll have read some of this in the news. It's kind of it's kind of had cut through, as they say in political speak. The UK government is very, very pro innovation, or states that it's very, very pro innovation. It's pro AI. It wants the UK to be a global leader in AI. the government thinks the best way to do that is not necessarily to be light touch in terms of regulation, but to be light touch in another name, really, I suppose, which is to be principles based rather than legislate. And the advantages, if deployed correctly, of the principles-based approach is that it does give flexibility. And what the government's saying is, we'll set these 5 key principles, and then we'll let the regulators, to the extent there is a regulator in the individual industry in question, to then deploy these principles, reflect these principles in the way that they see fit. So before I get on to talk about what the FCA, the PRA are doing in that regard, I think it's probably worth just recapping on what these principles are. So the first principle is safety, security, and robustness. This mandates that AI systems must function in a robust, secure, and safe manner throughout their life cycle. What does that mean in practice? Well, it means that if you're deploying an AI system, you've got to be continuously really assessing and managing the risks associated with that. I think in financial services, this principle is particularly important because if there is a system failure or some sort of malicious manipulation of the system, some sort of exploitation of a vulnerability in it, that's going to have, or could have, very significant financial repercussions for quite a large group of customers. All of this kind of feeds into, as I'll talk about in a moment, the kind of broader focus on operation and resilience in cybersecurity within financial services institutions. The second of the government's principles talks about appropriate transparency and explainability. This kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. Like, if you are deploying an AI system, you've got to be transparent about that, and you've got to be able to explain what you're using the system to do and how it goes about doing it. As I've mentioned, that's not easy to do. It's not easy to explain because a lot of these systems are pretty complicated, and if they are customer facing, the need to explain what's going on is even more important. So I'll talk about explainability again when we get into the financial services specific piece, but for now I'll just flag it there as one of the key principles. The next of the government's key principles is fairness. This is the principle that's really driving against bias. If you're using an AI system, it has to be staying true to the legal rights of individuals and the organizations who are interacting with it. Can't have unfair discrimination, can't have unfair market outcomes. So bias and rooting out bias is vitally important. As I've alluded to, that's particularly key in financial services when it comes to lending decisions, or when it comes to, say, who to insure and at what premium, because those products, as we know, are kind of fundamental to the lives of individuals. The fourth principle is accountability in governance. To comply with this, you have to have appropriate governance around the development, the training, and then perhaps most importantly, the deployment of AI systems in your organization. Senior managers and certification regime is kind of the cornerstone, isn't it, of accountability and governance in financial services. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later, but just to flag, the FCA is not proposing to make any changes to the detail of the security of the senior managers and certification regime to accommodate AI. And then finally, the fifth principle is contestability and redress. So simply put, if you are deploying an AI system, you've got to make sure that users or people impacted by its decisions are given some mechanism to challenge an AI decision, to challenge an AI outcome if they think it's wrong and in that it's harmful to them in some way. I think it's kind of vital that people have and recognize that they have the ability to do that. Without effective means of redress, I think public trust in in AI is going to be difficult to develop and maintain. So they're the 5 UK government principles. The government has left it in financial services very much up to the regulators to work out how to get into the detail of those. So I'll talk about that now. The FCA and the PRA and the Bank of England, as we know, have different regulatory remits. They're interested in different things. Perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, they are looking at AI through the lens of their own regulatory responsibilities, which leads perhaps inevitably and helpfully to slightly different areas of focus, which I'll go into in a bit. But there is a sufficient degree, I think, of commonality across what the FCA and the PRA and the Bank of England are doing to ensure that everybody's lined up. I think the big challenge for the regulators in FS is how do you is being seen to be pro-innovation, and because that's what the government wants, being seen to be flexible and innovative. That's often easy to say, but not always easy for a regulator to do. I personally think that the regulators are doing a pretty good job up to now, particularly the FCA. So the FCA, as we know, is really most interested in customer outcomes and in maintaining the integrity of the financial markets. So when it looks at AI, it's looking at it from those perspectives. The FCA is technology neutral. So what that means is when it regulates, it looks at outcomes from technology. It doesn't get too caught up with the finer points of the technology itself. I think that's kind of helpful when it comes to regulating AI, because AI means different things to different people. You know, in reality, it's kind of an amalgam of a number of different types of technology. The FCA isn't getting too hung up on any of that complexity. They're just saying, let's look at the outcome and let's look at the outputs of what this particular AI system. It's doing a huge amount. The FCA, some of its initiatives you'll have heard of already, some of them you may not have done. I'll go through them now. I mean, the main umbrella initiative is the FCA's AI Lab, and what that's trying to do is support innovators as they develop new AI models and solutions. So it's about helping innovators. It's also about helping the FCA keep its ear to the ground as to what's going on in the sector around AI development and what emerging risks could be. The AI Input Zone is a really important component of the lab. It's one of the FCA's primary sort of feedback mechanisms, and it's a way in which interested stakeholders can basically give their views to the FCA as to current and future uses of AI and how they should be regulated or not regulated, perhaps. The FCA earlier on this year convened an AI sprint, which some of you may have participated in. It was a collaborative event. It brought together representatives from the industry, from tech companies, both large, small, and medium size, academia. The regulatory bodies themselves were represented, and it was all about looking at the next 5 years, particularly. And how the technology might evolve and how the regulations may need to evolve to keep up. That sprint kind of culminated in a spotlight, an AI spotlight event, which we at Walker Morris participated in as an observer. It was an excellent event. It highlighted practical use cases and gave innovators the opportunity to showcase their solutions and to talk about, you know, what had worked well, what hadn't worked well, etc., etc. A really good event. I think the FCA have recognized the value of that spotlight because they've recently set up a digital repository to follow up the spotlight. And if you've not looked at it already, I would encourage you to do so. The repository is it's an interactive platform. It lists various real-world AI solutions in financial services. You can filter by use case, by issues such as explainability, you know, any kind of area of interest that you have. it's a very, very useful tool already, and I think it'll become more useful as its contents grow. The FCA has recently announced the supercharging of its AI sandbox. This sounds like a really interesting and exciting collaboration between the FCA, NVIDIA, and Neo One. You'll no doubt have heard of NVIDIA. They're the trillion-dollar tech business who effectively make and design all of the chips that are, or most of the chips that are powering the AI revolution. This, the supercharged sandbox, like any sandbox, gives developers a kind of safe place from the regulator's perspective to kind of play around and develop proof of concepts. The fact that it's supercharged, what does that mean in practice? Well, the FCA say you can get access to greater computing power. I think that's where the NVIDIA collaboration comes in. You can get access to data sets, which I think is where Neo One come in. And there's also mentoring and support available around the testing and the validation of AI solutions. So that is something firms will, the schedule for that is that firms will begin testing in the sandbox in October of this year. Alongside the sandbox, the FCA is launching a live AI testing service. And I think the idea is that kind of you use the supercharged sandbox to develop your proof of concept once you with an opportunity to engage with the regulator in real time as you're doing so. Once you've got past that point and you're getting rapidly closer to perhaps deployment in a live environment, as the name suggests, the live AI testing service gives you the opportunity to test ahead of that. I think it'll be particularly useful for high risk or potentially high risk AI systems. So by that I mean anything really that's customer facing or could be significantly customer impacting. The FCA about a week or so ago announced that applications for that live testing, the door would be open for applications later this month, and that the launch of the service is scheduled for September. So in addition to all of that engagement piece, which I think you'll agree there's a lot, the FCA has said that it plans to host a roundtable with smaller firms later this year in an effort to better understand the challenges that smaller firms, as the FCA describes them, are having around AI adoption. A bit of a watch this space on that as to when it'll be and how firms can put themselves forward to participate. But I think there's possibly a number of firms represented on this call for whom, at the very least, the output of that roundtable discussion will be very helpful. The FCA is not just regulating, it's not just looking out into the market as to what's going on with AI, it's kind of proving its own AI credentials by using AI itself. Advanced analytics is a use case that the FCA is already deploying AI for. So they've had good results in terms of using AI to enhance their ability to find scam websites, to do sanction screening, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all positive. The FCA is also quite excited about AI's ability to help the FCA maintain the integrity of the market by identifying complex types of market abuse and to identify really complicated chains of what is essentially market manipulative activity. I guess due to the complexity and the amount of data that can be involved in that type of analysis, the ability for humans to do it at scale is probably limited. So I think the FCA quite rightly is looking at that and thinking, well, that could be an area where AI, due to its advantages, will be particularly beneficial to us. And I think that has the potential to be good for every market participant, because we've all got an interest in the market operating in a way that it's can be trusted and has clearly got integrity. I'll talk about the consumer duty in a bit, but the FCA, as I've sort of alluded to a few times already, consumer duty, customer outcomes, making sure that AI is not detracting or devaluing those is really key. The PRA, well, as we know, the PRA focuses on financial safety and soundness of firms, so slightly different focus to the FCA, and the Bank of England is looking at the stability of the financial system as a whole. So they're looking at AI in that way. Similar to the FCA, though, they're both technology neutral, technology agnostic, which is a good consistency across the regulators. What are the areas that the PRA are focused on when it comes to AI? Well, they're very focused on systemic risk. So from their perspective, they look at AI and say, right, well, if a lot of financial institutions start using AI, start relying on AI for core financial decision-making processes, that's clearly going to introduce systemic risks. If there are vulnerabilities or flaws in underlying AI models that are being used across the system, well, that could then lead multiple firms to misjudge risk, get pricing wrong, misallocate credit. That's going to have potentially a significant systemic impact on the market as a whole. Correlated trading behavior could be another thing that, well, is something that the PR is worried that it's going to start seeing. That is going to amplify shocks to the system rather than mitigate them, which is already something of a problem due to other technological advancements in trading activity. The PRA, there's a huge focus on operational risk. So as we know, industry-wide, there's a sense that over the past 5 to 10 years, financial institutions have become increasingly reliant on an increasingly small list of providers for certain forms of real critical tech. Cloud capability is the one that's most often cited. Whilst it's possibly a little bit too early to say, we are seeing a concentration of AI-related development and AI-related tech in a relatively small number of providers. That's largely because, stating the obvious, foundation models, there are only a few, there aren't a lot of Meta AIs, OpenAI, Google AI. There are only a small number of technology organizations that have got the compute power and the financial muscle to develop those types of underlying foundation models. So we are probably going to see, or certainly the PRA is concerned that over time we are going to see that kind of critical supplier concentration risk. So it's now very alive to the fact that AI needs to be successfully and appropriately woven in to the activities that it's doing in terms of regulating operational risk and critical third parties. PRA is interested in cybersecurity, a big issue and has been for some time for FS in particular. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, AI, when it comes to cybersecurity. Clearly, it can enhance a firm's ability to defend itself from cyber attack, but equally, it can also enhance the ability for a bad actor to deploy a cyber attack with a greater degree of sophistication and/or at a much larger scale. It'll be interesting to see who wins that race. The other thing with AI is that AI systems, particularly when they're interfacing with other systems, which a lot of them do in order to get the data that they need, they do create vulnerabilities. They do create new vulnerabilities to attack. So that all needs the PRA's in its work around cybersecurity it wants to see that firms are alive to those AI specific elements. And model risk management. So the PRA's interest, firms have been using models for a long time. The PRA has got detailed rules around model risk management and an approach to overseeing those. For the moment, at least, the PRA is saying, well, an AI model deployed in a business, it's just another form of model. So it needs to be developed and monitored and updated in the same way that any other model does. So just finally here on moving over to the AI consortium, I mean, this is a Bank of England initiative. It's a continuation of industry engagement that the bank has been doing for some time in the space of AI, alongside the AI consortium and everything that the PRA and the FCA are doing. As you may have noticed, the UK government's Treasury Select Committee has also relatively recently put out a call for evidence on AI in financial services. So there's a huge amount going on in terms of the regulators and what they've been up to. Applying existing laws and regulations. So getting into the detail of it, the regulators are trying to be pro-innovation, trying to be adaptable and flexible by essentially adopting a apply existing rules, don't write new rules approach. That has the potential to be very, very helpful because it means there's a whole new raft of, it means there's not new rules that firms need to get comfortable with on top of all of the existing regulations. The risk clearly is that existing laws and regulations were not written with AI in mind. So interpreting them and applying them to a new technology is not an easy thing to do. And some of the feedback that the regulators have been receiving from firms has flagged that. And I think that's why we are seeing, particularly the FCA, try so hard with its supercharged sandbox, its live testing, et cetera, to try and bridge that gap, to give firms more comfort that the AI system that they are using in a certain use case is okay from a regulatory standpoint, or needs to be tweaked to be okay from a compliance standpoint. That said, just going through these existing laws and regulations, these aren't all of them, but at a very high level, senior managers and certification regime. If AI is deployed in your firm, it may be deployed in one functional area, it may be deployed in many. There will be a senior manager, or there is likely to be a senior manager under the regime who is accountable and has a statement of responsibility covering that function. The FCA is not planning on changing the regime, but is making the obvious point that in that situation, the senior manager's statement of responsibility needs to be updated appropriately to reflect the fact that the senior manager has now an AI system deployed in their function. It may be like lots of forms of technology. It may be that it spans a number of senior managers because it's deployed in a number of different functions, in which case updating each individual statement of responsibility and in an appropriate way will be really important. The consumer duty is absolutely vital. Anything that's customer facing, you need to look at that very, very carefully to ensure that it's adhering to the consumer duty. Any business that's using AI is going to want the AI to be acting in an accurate way, to be providing information that's not misleading, to be not hallucinating, to be not discriminating against customers when it comes to accessibility to products, et cetera, et cetera. That applies to any organization, to any business. But in FS, the kind of incentive for that has regulatory teeth as well in the form of consumer duty. So it's very important. Data protection. This isn't an FS specific rule or regime, obviously. Here in the UK, but it's relevant for the purposes of FS. We've got the UK GDPR here. We could kind of do a whole different session on the data protection elements of AI deployment. But for now, just to state the obvious, perhaps, AI is regulated and is subject to the UK GDPR in the same way that other technologies are. There's no separate treatment for AI. The UK GDPR's provisions around privacy, security, fairness, technical and organizational measures to ensure those securities to ensure that security is vitally important. Also, as a practical point, when you're training your AI model, what data are you using to train it? Are you using synthetic data, or are you using real data that has come from live customers? If it's the latter, for data protection purposes, are you comfortable that you've got a lawful basis to justify your use of that customer personal data for training purposes? Outsourcing and third-party risk management. So the rules in this space are applied. This is I think this is something that we see a lot of organizations struggling with. And I think part of the reason for that is because outsourcing and third-party risk management, a lot. It's not all contractual. You have to have the frameworks in place to make sure that you are, to the extent you're using an AI vendor, you need to be, keeping an eye on them and monitoring them in the way that you would any other important tech vendor. But the contract is a big part of it, right? And the rules recognize that by mandating that certain things need to be covered off in the contract. One of the things that we're noticing is that a lot of AI vendors, particularly if they're relatively small startup or scale-up developers who've taken an underlying foundation model and trained it and tailored it to a specific use case, without wishing to do those vendors a disservice, they're often not as sophisticated when it comes to contracts and contract protection as a larger, more established vendor would be. They're often not particularly au fait with the types of operational resilience, audit, information rights, etc., that financial services institutions insist on for compliance reasons. So getting the contract right can be difficult. And an AI vendor contract, as you may know if you've worked on one, a lot of the contractual issues that are relevant from the perspective of any contract are relevant when it comes to AI, but they just need to be looked at in a slightly more nuanced and complex way. So say, data licensing, you'll probably be licensing the AI vendor. You'll be probably need to give it some license over your data to do certain things, to train the model. Is that just to train the model for your use, or is it to train the system for the whole customer base's use? When it comes to liability, who's liable for what? If something goes wrong, is that because of your training data or the way that you're deploying the system? Is it because of the development work that the AI vendor has done to the base foundation model, or is it a problem in the foundation model itself? So liability is an important and nuanced issue. And model risk management, that's those rules are just being applied for now in the normal way. So I mean, just to start to wrap up, where do I think we might be going with all of this? As I hopefully have shown, the focus now is very much around principles-based, applying existing rules rather than new rules. I think there'll be a lot of benefits if that were to continue, but the fact that the industry is already telling the regulator that approach is having an unintended consequence, i.e. it's difficult for firms to apply existing regulations to a complex evolving technology, makes me think that we might see in the coming year or two the regulator moving towards a more prescriptive approach when it comes to certain AI use cases, particularly if they're high risk or customer facing. I think we might start to see at a UK government level a move away for certain use cases from principles-based as best. I think we might start to see the government being a little bit more prescriptive when it comes to legislating AI. In a way, they've already signaled their intention to, or they've already signaled a willingness to do that, because in the King's speech, the then new Labour government said that they were intending to establish appropriate legislation to regulate the developers of the most powerful artificial intelligence models. And I think who they mean by that is the Open AIs and the Google AIs, the big tech effectively. So I think we might see a move towards more prescriptive legislation and rules in certain use cases over the next year or two. I could be wrong, but I think that I think we need to certainly be alive to that possibility. And obviously, you don't need to look very far to start to get an inkling as to what a more prescriptive, a more legislative approach would look like, right? Because you've got the EU AI Act, which is very, very different to the approach that's been taken up to now in the UK. It's highly prescriptive. It's an act, so it's legislative in its nature. But some of the concepts in there are quite useful, like thinking about high-risk systems and how they have to be dealt with differently and how they have to be deployed differently. The EU AI Act requirement that anybody who's developing or deploying AI, make sure their staff are trained, that they're AI literate. Now, that seems to make sense. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that or something similar started to creep in here in the UK. And then also another incentive for some sort of increased regulatory alignment, not necessarily just with the EU, but globally, is like any technology, the technology itself and the tech developers of it. Obviously they're they're often, they don't adhere to borders. They're not. It's a geographically agnostic thing. So international alignment would be helpful. So just to conclude, some core messages, just to reiterate them. Number one, AI is being used in the FS industry already. I think we're going to see it being deployed much more widely over the next year or two. So it's an evolving and dynamic technology. The regulator is trying to have as dynamic and responsive a regime to reflect that as it can. Second takeaway, the regulators, to their credit, I think, are very, very engaged in listening to the industry and finding out what's going on, particularly the FCA. At the moment, it's about applying existing regulations. So if you are on the cusp of deploying AI in your business, really make sure that you understand what the applicable regulations are and how they need to be applied to the use case in the system that you're using. If you are using a third-party vendor to help you, which you invariably, I guess, will be, very few people, it's very rare to see somebody developing one of these things on a solely proprietary basis. Make sure you get the contract right. Make sure that not only there's the requisite degree of regulatory flow through from a operational risk, critical third parties perspective, but even absent that, if it's not material enough to warrant that, still make sure that you've got things like intellectual property, data licensing, liability. You've got all of that nailed down. And I think we're gonna, on a positive note, I do think we're going to see the tech going in just one direction, with the benefits becoming more and more fulsome and more obvious. I think we are already doing a pretty effective job at certainly identifying the risks and with the help from the regulators, mitigating those. But it is certainly something that all firms should be keeping a very close eye on. Now, we don't have any time for Q&A, but you should be able to see my contact details there on the screen. Do feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions, or if there are any other points that you want to discuss after today's session, or alternatively, if you'd prefer to do so, feel free to reach out to your client partner or your usual client contact here at the firm, and they'll be able to get in touch with me. But for today's purposes, thanks again for your attention. I hope you found it useful, and enjoy the rest of your day.